cultivate a capacity for kindness. So, close your eyes. Take a few moments to breathe in and breathe out. But I would say on a deeper level, it's more like when we say work on yourself. That involves all kinds of like things about moving your life forward. And they struggle with
motivation in these things.
It's because when I don't think I'm worth it, I'm not worth fixing.
When you develop empathy and compassion for other people, there's going to be room for someone else in the relationship. And then this in turn is going to reduce the feeling of being an object. Now two people can connect. And now it's not about getting your needs met in starvation. It's about two human beings forming a relationship.
Alrighty, chat. Let's get started. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Dr. Alok Kanoja. Just a reminder that even though I'm a medical doctor, nothing we discuss on stream is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything is for educational or entertainment purposes only. If y'all have a medical concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. I will also be joined by the illustrious Dr. Michael Shu today, who is also a medical doctor, but nothing he is going to say today will constitute medical advice. We're just going to be two psychiatrists talking about faith, mental health, and psychedelics. So if y'all have, questions that are specific to your mental health or physical health needs, please go see a licensed professional. So like Dr. Shu and I go back a couple years now. Y'all may have remembered, I think he came on to talk about maybe marijuana addiction a couple of years ago. And so we were talking about this. We met up about a year ago and we were just like having a conversation about it. And I was like, oh, this would be like fantastic on stream. So he's been kind enough to join us again. Before we jump in though, just wanted to let y'all know, so not everyone is aware we have a coaching program. So I know it sounds kind of insane. So we talked about seeing a mental health professional or a health professional if you guys have physical or mental health problems, diagnoses, things like that. But one of the reasons that I sort of stepped away from full-time clinical work and started doing work like this is because I was seeing that a lot of my patients needed help in ways that are not necessarily therapy. We as therapists are not trained necessarily in goal accomplishment. So there's a field of therapy called positive psychology, which then over time evolved into what we call coaching nowadays. And I think a lot of the challenges that people are facing nowadays, I think really coaches can be helpful for. And that's why we started a coaching program, because there's a lot of stuff, if we sort of think about what mental health professionals do, we're trained in pathology and diagnosis. So things like mood disorders, anxiety disorders, but we're not necessarily trained in helping people get promoted at their jobs. Those are not formal courses we take. I'm not saying that therapists can't help with that. And especially with I don't know if this kind of makes sense. One of the weird things that I see on the internet, I see two things. One is, everyone will say oh, you should go see a therapist about that. And that can be incredibly frustrating for some people because therapy is not the answer to all problems. And what's even more frustrating is that some people will go see a therapist. I used to hear this story a lot. I hear it less so now, but mostly because I don't spend time with those people. But I went to a therapist and it didn't help as much as I wanted it to, or it didn't help as much as people claimed it would. And so if y'all are someone who's really struggling with how the world is changing incredibly rapidly, there's a lot of uncertainty in the world around dating, around careers, these kinds of topics, then I strongly recommend y'all take a look at coaching, our coaching program, anyone else's coaching program. I like ours because ours has a lot of data behind it. So we've trained, we've had several batches of coaches go through our coaching curriculum. And each batch seems to get better and better and better. So, I think our coaching program is actually improving. I recently heard some statistics about fewer people are canceling than ever. So people are getting more and more value out of coaching. People are kind of sticking with it. I think we're learning what y'all need. So if y'all are interested in sort of figuring out how to really make progress in your goals in a finite amount of time, which I think is the real advantage of it. It's 12 weeks from now, do you want to be noticeably further along in your journey? Because there's a lot of great stuff that we provide here. We do DIY kind of educational content and things like that. And that's all really awesome stuff. But one second. Hello? Okay, got it. Thanks. I just noticed. Bye. So if y'all, if you're, what was I going to say? I lost my train of thought. Anyway, so if y'all are interested, check it out for sure. So before, since I just realized I wasn't live, I wasn't actually dual streaming. Hello, people from Twitch. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Dr. Alok Kanoja. Just a reminder that Although I'm a psychiatrist, nothing we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything is for educational and entertainment purposes only. If y'all have a medical concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. Anyway, today we're going to be talking with Michael Shu. So let me just mute this for just a hot second. And we're going to be talking about faith, psychedelics, and mental health. So let me go ahead and hopefully this works. Hey, Michael, can you say something? Hey, okay, perfect. Count to 10 for me.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, perfect.
6.
And then let me go ahead and see if I can fix this. No. There we go. Okay. Oh, and this looks like it needs to be adjusted a little bit. I'm going to just fix this real quick. Perfect. Okay. Hey, what's up, dude?
Hey,
How
not
you
much,
been?
man. Good to see you. Are we live right now?
Yes, we're
Is
live.
this- Oh, snap. All right. Good to see you.
Good to see
How are
you
you
too.
doing?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Doing well. I'll be honest, a little terrified being on stream,
Why?
with folks watching and stuff like that. I don't think I'll ever sort of get over that. I mean, that aspect of it, but I'm also just super excited, man.
Yeah.
I'm excited to have this conversation with you. One thing I really love about our friendship over the years is that, like, we can talk a ton about the science of stuff and like mental health and the research and get really into that stuff. But then we also are sort of deeply spiritual people, and we've sort of connected a lot around that over the years. And
Yeah.
so, I think I'm excited to see where this will go.
So that's actually let's kind of just start there. So I think the topics that we've sort of floated today are psychedelics, faith, and mental health. Is that right?
Yeah, that sounds right to me.
And I think so. You mentioned that we're spiritual people. So can you tell me a little bit about your flavor of spirituality?
Sure. And by the way, do you go by Alok on stream, or should I call you like
Whatever you
Dr. K, Sorcerer, Supreme,
whatever you
Master of
want
the
to. I
Mystic
mean,
Arts,
whatever feels
something like that?
comfortable for you.
Okay. All right, Alec. So your question is like, where do I come from
Yeah. Can you
spiritually? Is
tell us a little
that
bit
right?
about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll say that I spent most of my life sort of I would call it an atheist pool, atheist, agnostic. I grew up. My father, came from like the age of the Cultural Revolution. Would talk about religion as sort of like brainwashing, just like sort of indoctrination based on that age of things. I had an uncle who got caught up in a cult, some kind of like, I don't know, Christian cult or something like that. Let's just say it was not pretty. And The only kind of personal sort of spiritual-esque thing that I had growing up was like I had grandparents who were Buddhists, and I had a grandma who we had a Buddhist statue, like a little mini Buddha in front of our door, and my mom would be like, rub the Buddha's forehead, and it'll give you some good luck. So of course, like I would like have an exam coming up, probably spent like 10 hours playing Diablo and like half an hour thinking about this exam. On my way, I'm like, okay, all right, let's rub this dude's forehead and see what we got here. And sometimes it'll pan out, sometimes it wouldn't quite pan out. But yeah, that was kind of my spiritual upbringing. I got in trouble a lot growing up. I asked a ton of questions. I was kind of a skeptic. Honestly, would make fun of like people who were kind of spiritual in some sense, or like Christians and stuff like that.
Well,
Growing up, I would ask a lot of questions in class. I would be really disruptive. I got in trouble a ton, and at the end of the day, I
well,
feel like if there was like a character select screen, and one of those characters were, they're like good student, like, athlete or whatever. If there was like a troll character select, I think somehow that one got got sort of what. Yeah. So I'll stop there because I feel like you have
Yeah, yeah.
a
So
question.
two things. First is, are you sure that you're transmitting from your mic and not your? Can you just check your Discord
Ooh,
settings real quick? I just want to double check.
that is a great question. Um, I think it is.
Okay, great. It sounds pretty clear. So it's I'm getting a
It
slight
does.
echo. So
Okay. If I need to go back to like my MacBook Air
no,
or
no, no.
whatever
This is
it's.
fine. This is fine as long as it's the right. It's not like your camera. But um, so I was kind of curious when you say you were like like kind of skeptical growing up. So were you
Yeah.
skeptical about, and your parents were basically atheists, right?
My parents are atheists. Yeah,
So
I would say maybe nowadays my mom would say maybe agnostic, but growing up for sure, I think. Um, yeah, I remember having conversations with my dad to be like, "Don't waste your time with that stuff. Focus on your studies. A plus, get your A plus on your exams. Stop failing. That kind of thing."
okay. And so when you
Yeah.
say you asked a lot of questions, like, do you mean you asked a lot of questions to your parents? You asked questions to people who were spiritual, or just like in general at
Hmm.
school? Like, I was trying to fit that into you know, your story about atheism, skepticism.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say I probably didn't ask too many questions at home. My parents had to work really long hours to provide for the family. Wouldn't come home until late. Hence, I spent gobs of time playing like RuneScape, StarCraft, that kind of thing. Our conversations were pretty superficial. Um, I would honestly just ask questions in class a lot of times just to be like disruptive. I probably just like was a little attention starved and very hyperactive too. I couldn't sit
Okay,
still in my seat. Um, I mean, I could give you examples of some of the random questions I would
sure.
ask. I mean, some questions were truly asking of myself, like, what is the meaning of life and the purpose of all this stuff? But
You would
I mean,
ask that at school?
huh? No, to myself. No, no, no.
Okay,
I wouldn't ask my classmates. Yeah, no, they would. Yeah. But yeah, like I remember in computer science class, for example, right? There was like we had to like develop a program in like seventh grade, and you input two numbers in, and if you press A, you're supposed to program this like thing to add them together. And then if you press B, it's supposed to subtract them. And then C, it's supposed to multiply D's to divide, right? And then E is like exit the program, right? And then I don't know why, but I was like, okay, what happens if you press F? And the teacher was like, we're not talking about pressing F, man. Just like focus. A to E, focus, man. And I was like, what happens if you don't have a keyboard? And then she just like kicked me out of class and sent me to the principal's office. I don't know, just like random things
hmm,
sometimes. But
interesting.
I mean but I think kind of on a deeper sense, I also ask a lot of questions of myself too. Like, is this all there is to life? Just like going to school, being told to sit down, listen to this teacher all day, come home, um, play RuneScape, mine coal for like 8 hours at a time. I spent gobs of time mining coal and iron. Looking back, I'm like, wow, yeah, every kid's dream to be mining coal in a coal mine. But yeah, so yeah, it's I mean, it's I think I kind of developed a pretty deep depression too
Hmm.
sometime in middle school. Yeah.
And what
Um,
was that like? Are you comfortable talking about that?
oh yeah, I'm
Okay.
happy to talk about.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
what was that? So I'm wondering, first of all, like, do you think there's a connection between sort of like asking those big questions and developing depression?
I think so. I think so,
How
yeah,
so?
because, um, yeah, that's a really good question. I think that well, I think that one, I started developing all sorts of like feelings around like my life stage, right? And like looking at like the material world around me and what's adding up, right? And so, um,
Can you
I
explain
think
that?
at
What
one
does that
point.
mean? What the material world is like? What's adding up?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, literally at one point, I think when I was maybe 14, 15, I was kind of like looking at life, right? As like, okay, there's a lot of suffering going on in life, a lot of negative experiences. Coming home, being yelled at, getting like C's and D's and report cards, going to school, getting in trouble a lot, right? And then I sort of just like started adding up, like, okay, what are all these negative things going on in my life? And then what are the positives about life and living? Okay. I don't know. Like I mined coal
Yeah. And iron.
and that made me happy. That literally was like that, or like winning a game in StarCraft, or getting like a perfect Griffin or something like that in Diablo. Yeah, these things were like positives, but I was like, man, is this really all life? All there was to life? And like my parents would tell me it's all about getting straight A's and going to college and stuff like that. And I was like, really? Like that's it? And so at some point I just did like this expected value, I guess, equation for my life. And I was like, dude, like the negatives far outweigh the positives of living. And so at a certain point I was like, it's better to die than to live. Like what is the point of living? And so I was suicidal at probably age like 13. And yeah, I think asking a lot of those questions, um, I mean, I saw definitely some of the kids around me who maybe were not really thinking about these things a
Hmm.
lot. I guess they kind of, got their straight A's, did well in school, sat, maybe went to church or like, and stuff like that. And they were kind of doing their thing. And they didn't. Yeah, I don't know. It just seemed like there'd be, it just seemed like there weren't that many folks that I could look around who were asking these same questions, and maybe like a handful. But yeah, all of us, I felt like we're kind of in that like, man, this is rough
You
kind
know,
of
so it's
patch.
so interesting to thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
I think what really like leaps out to me is how logical it is. So, when we
Hmm.
talk about like, when I think about a patient who's like 13 years old, who's suicidal and depressed, I primarily think about like an emotional valence, right? I think about a kid who is like, whose predominant emotional experience is sadness, maybe has cognitive biases, and that this is like a pathology, like their life really isn't that bad. Their
Hmm.
mind just isn't able to see the good stuff in their life. But when I listen to you, it sounds incredibly like logical, right? Like you sat down. I'm not hearing like a whole lot of like, maybe there's sadness, but it's kind of like a logical sadness that comes from a conclusion. Like it's your lived experience of life is kind of like you said, you just kind of added things up. Okay, like I get yelled at home. I don't do well at school. I get sent to the principal's office. Um, and even like the fun stuff in life is like not that engaging. There's really no sense of direction or meaning. And so it sounds like it kind of incredibly logical to me.
Hmm. Yeah, I think so. And yeah, it almost sounded like a math equation to me.
Yeah.
Like numbers was something I was very like I enjoyed. I was like comfortable. And I don't know.
Like any
I
good
just like
Asian
that
kid.
one subject.
Yeah. So,
Yes, I
so what,
so
what
but there
happened?
was an emotional part of it too. I don't want to
Yeah.
detract from as well. I mean, looking back and after going through therapy and working through my own sort of psychoanalysis and later spiritual life, I did realize that there was a lot of this deep-seated kind of anger, unexpressed feelings towards my parents for sort of this really restrictive environment at home and towards teachers. And yeah, I think there was a lot of anger there that I didn't really understand or really know how to express in the moment of that. And I didn't really know what to do with it. So I realized like I started hating myself a lot. And so that anger, I definitely had internalized that too. And I would find reasons sometimes to like hate myself, and like stuff like, oh man, I'm like cheated on the test, or like, oh, like man, like I don't know, like I dropped in my StarCraft rating or whatever, and it's just stuff like that, and find kind of these reasons. And so there was definitely an emotional experience as well, but yeah, I think was kind of both. It felt like that was it. Like I wasn't gonna live till I was an adult at that point. So, um, that's really how I felt,
Yeah, so
at that.
I'm kind of throw back to, and this conversation may be a bit meandering because we're both psychiatrists, but I don't know if you've ever like I recently started reading Mourning and Melancholia, which is like
Hmm.
Freud's classic paper
Yeah,
on,
yeah, yeah,
and just
yeah,
I've come to really appreciate this idea of like anger directed against the self is what the
yeah.
root of depression is. Um,
Hmm.
and so it's really interesting to kind of hear that you were like really like you're kind of like a textbook example, of this principle of like when you can't be angry at your teachers and you can't be angry at your parents, you end up being like the anger only has one place to go, which is you direct it towards yourself.
Yeah,
And
100%.
and I thought it was beautiful how you said, I mean, it's also scary, but like you were looking for reasons to like be mad at yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that's it really reminds me of a lot of um, what I see in people who struggle like you did. So
Yeah.
so what happened after that? Like what?
Yeah. So, and this is, I guess, where things kind of go in an interesting direction. But I had a plan at that point, probably around 13 to 14, to end my life. There was a forest in the back of our place, and I had a knife and everything. And I won't go into too much detail or anything like that, but I remember just one night just holding that knife and just like waiting for my parents to go to bed, and I was sort of, I was done. I was done. Like
Did they
my
have a
mind was
sense that
done, my
something
body was
was
done.
wrong?
I'm sorry?
Did they have a sense that something was wrong?
I think they had a sense in that like I wasn't getting good grades, I was acting out, but I think their kind of thinking of it was like it was like weakness. Like, you need to try harder, you need to push, you need to exercise more. Um, and so yeah, I mean, and they came from a different generation, right? And so I felt like had to repress a lot of these feelings to
Mm,
survive and make it out of like a really sort of yeah, a very difficult environment that was Cultural Revolution China, to like make it out to America. And there wasn't time to like sit with your emotions and
sure.
process it. It was like you either get out of here and you study your butt off, or you're done.
Yeah.
And so
So
like that was kind of, they brought that sort of mindset over. And it just, we just didn't, yeah, it would just be a lot of shouting and like them being like, don't be a coward, like you are, yeah, you need to like, yeah, if you keep getting bad grades, we'll send you to Afghanistan.
oh my
And
god,
like I'm
dude.
like, whoa, Afghanistan, that's scary. I don't want to be in a boot camp in Afghanistan. I better sit down and study for algebra for a bit. Obviously that didn't like last too long. But that's the kind of conversations I would have with him.
Oh
Yeah.
my god, dude, that sounds awful.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
And
can't imagine talking to my kids that way. Like it's
I can't imagine you doing that either.
maybe they disagree, but um yeah, so you were saying like you would kind of, it was the moment you had sort of talked about that evening and you were ready. What happened?
And so, yeah, I was sort of just staring down at myself and thinking about this plan. And all of a sudden, I know this might sound crazy, but I heard like an audible voice coming from somewhere that was like, "Hey, this isn't the end of your life. There's some hope." And I had no idea where this was coming from at the time, because it really felt like, something or someone. Like it wasn't just one of those like, "Hey man, like I'm let's eat some McDonald's today." It was like real for me. And so I was like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, what is going on here?" And I didn't know what to make of it. I mean, I didn't had no religious background or anything, or like spiritual background, but um, and I was still, I ended up not going forward with that plan that day. Still deeply depressed, but went into high school. Things got a lot better for me in high school on a circumstance perspective. Like, for some reason, I started to study a little bit more. I was I played a lot of tennis and I started doing better and I was like doing really well on the tennis team, dated, a very attractive girl and stuff like
Nice.
that. I had all the yeah, I had, doing well in my games, in what kind of like weird like way, ego boosting way that was. And I was like, man, I have like everything. Like I'm good. But then even as I was telling myself that going to school every day, hey, you got these grades, you got you're this good at tennis and whatever. I was like kind of boosting my own ego to make myself feel better. There was like still this deep emptiness that I just couldn't shake. Like there was something missing in my life still. And I knew it had something to do with what I had heard that
Hmm.
night. And I just didn't know what. And so for me, I started sort of my own personal journey of just reflecting and um, reading, and I found something truthful about some of the songs that yeah, I would just have friends who I guess went to church, or and they would send me these like worship songs of with Jesus and stuff like that, and there's something that about that kind of tuned my ear a little bit into. And this is kind of the interesting part that I think about because I know we'll get to psychedelics at some point, whatever. But when Albert Hoffman, this is a little bit of a side, maybe a little meandering, but when he discovered LSD, right? It was like kind of just random chemical thing that he was doing as a chemist. The way he would describe it later in life is that he didn't discover
Hmm.
LSD, but LSD found him, right? And it's like I yeah, I felt like throughout high school, as much as I could say that I was trying to learn about God or explore it on my own, I really felt like God found me in that. So I can go into that a little bit more, but I
Yeah.
ended up obviously I was a huge skeptic and I still am sort of. I still, question things and stuff like that, sure. But I started reading stuff on that C.S. Lewis wrote, on Mere Christianity, just sort of a critical review of of that. I started reading, Richard Dawkins on God delusion. I started reading Case for Christ. I started just really asking what is actually going on here? I'm not about to embark on some fantasy
Yeah.
belief here. If I'm gonna but I'm gonna put my effort into it because I'm not going to live my whole life also pretending that I'm okay or that I'm fine, and I refuse to do that. So I definitely did a lot of reading, and at the end of the day I was intellectually satisfied with what I read about the person of Jesus, about his dying on the cross, the resurrection, and that sort of thing. And then but I don't think it was until this one moment when I don't know if you know Lifehouse. It was like a band
Yeah. Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
90s,
Yeah.
back in the day. Um, yeah, they had a song called Everything.
Okay.
Um, and there was this skit that was going on, and and so in that skit it's this lady, and she's hanging out with I guess Jesus or this a representative, and they were I guess in the garden and having a good time. And then these dark things started to bring her out of that depression. She started to cut herself, and then she chased after money and after partying and glory. And I was like, dude, that's me. This is
Hmm.
I looked into I tried to make my life about the the party, the money, the and depression. This is me. And at the end of the skit, yeah, I guess the person of Jesus would came in and took all these, I guess, people that represented these different dark, like sinful beings, I guess, and just took that on the cross and died for that. And
How does that work?
did
What
it.
does that mean? How do you understand that?
Yeah. So my understanding of it is that because of these sins, and sort of I see this also in my own therapy and stuff like that and psychology, but the definition of sin is things that just separate us from God or our relationship with God. And so we pursue different things, I guess. Like it could be material things. It could be like defenses, like like avoidance or things like that too can prevent us from relating to people around us and that kind of thing. And so my understanding is that um, in order to be, I guess, with this all holy or righteous God, there needed to be someone to help kind of like um right this darkness in us, if that makes sense. Um, and because God is good, and this is sort of like what separates us from God. How do you bridge this gap if we have all these like defenses and sins and things like that? So, and that's where Jesus comes in. He's like, all this shame that you got, all this shame about all this stuff you're going after, all the times you cheated, all the times whatever, like that shame is put onto this person of Jesus, and the punishment for that shame is his death
So
on the
he's
on
like he's like main tank of the human race.
dude, that's a great that's a great portrayal. Yeah, he's like 1v5 main tanking and
Okay.
somehow healing self. Actually, no, he just dies, I guess. So he just straight up dies. But he's like good tank, good tank. That is, yeah. So he tanks it, dies so that we don't have to carry that shame anymore, and that when God sees us in this sort of like more this like positive light of righteousness that represented Jesus, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I
So
follow
kind of a swapping
I
of
follow
sorts.
kind of parts of it and don't follow other
Sure.
parts, which
Yeah.
is I know that's why I actually like talking to you because I think we'll kind of get
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
So just to
Mhm.
clarify a couple things. So one is like so what I'm basically hearing is that you were like literally saved by God. Like you're on the like you're planning a suicidal act and you have like an auditory hallucination, right? Or like
Sure.
that's one
Yeah.
way to characterize it, right? And that's what's so like interesting
Mhm.
about this conversation. So
Yeah.
like you like literally heard a voice that
Uh-huh.
somehow so it's not it wasn't a thought like your subjective experience of it was that it wasn't like a voice from within you. It was actually like a sensory input
Hmm. Yeah.
and
There's a sensory input. Yeah.
and so then that kind of started you on this journey. You've sort of felt an emptiness inside you prior to that was not
Hmm.
satisfied by material things, even as
Hmm.
I'm kind of thinking about like the 13-year-old who like made the calculation and decided, okay, life is not worth living. And then maybe there's 16-year-olds you, 17-year-old you who made the calculation and decided life is worth living because now you're playing tennis, you're dating a hot girl, you're doing better in like pre-calculus or whatever you're taking, right? So now the
Yeah.
equation is in your favor, but still something is like missing.
Yes. Yes.
And so what I'm almost hearing, if I were to try to like make a model of your experience of this, it's like there's this void in you and connection with God is what fills up that void,
Yes.
and
Yes. Yeah.
sin is what separates the two of you. That's kind of how you're defining.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Sin separates the two of you. This person and Jesus bridges this gap. and and yeah, this personal relationship with God, helps fill that. And so yeah, I forgot what I was going to say, but that's right. And yeah, I think probably there's a term like noetic quality of it, but like sort of like, yeah, there's like that voice, and I've had mystical experiences since then, that I just can't explain. I feel like I'm like, I think Carl Jung also describes this in his autobiography too, but like it's like there's these two parts of like this material world where like I'm a researcher, right? And we do research, and like, I'm trained to think very critically in terms of my clinical work about research, you know randomized control trials. I spend a lot of the day like thinking about that, and like that kind of thing. But then there's these mystical experiences that it's just like, man, like there's not it's like, this spiritual or mystical quality of like certain experiences. And I'm like, this you can't explain this with like RCTs. It's like a different
Mhm.
it's like a personal thing, right? And so, yeah.
So a couple questions. One is so what do you think about some of these? I mean, I can only imagine how people are reacting to this, because I think there's a very tight association on the internet between religiosity and
Mhm.
stupidity. So there's kind
Yeah.
of this, there's this assumption that, okay, like, this guy's now talking about the person of Jesus, therefore I'm going to bucket him into someone who is illogical, does not understand science, et cetera, et cetera. So I can imagine there's a lot of all kinds of reactions. I'm sure that there's some people who are also religious or spiritual who are not idiots. I know it sounds crazy, who are listening to this and are hopefully very happy that we're engaging in this conversation, and hopefully you're a good representative of an intelligent, religious, spiritual person. So what I'm kind of curious about is, when you read things like the God delusion, right? And you read things about atheistic arguments against the existence of God. How do you understand those arguments, and how does your experience reconcile with against those?
Yeah. Ooh, that is a really good and a really big question. Yeah, I first of all, I would just say that I think there is this huge thinking of science and spirituality. Like these things just don't mesh. Either you're a man of science or you're a man of the spirit. And I feel like, people in the scientific realm would say anything spiritual is just eh. And then also in the spiritual realm, people who go to church or religious people are like, science is just nonsensical and conspiracy and all, I don't know, mistrust and that sort of thing. And so, yeah, I'm just maybe I think it's important to have these conversations and to understand that science, it provides observations about the world, right? And so, whatever you believe about the world, how the Big Bang happened, or however it's created, these are just or this, however science might explain it, these are phenomena that we can observe. Spirituality, but what science doesn't do is it doesn't answer questions about why, right? Why are things happening, or what is the purpose of these things, and and aspects like love and experiences like love. And so and certain things like spirituality,
So
is an area where that might uh, be a place of exploration. But anyway, yeah, you're about to say
yeah,
something.
I was going to kind of challenge that view for a second, if that's okay.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
And I'm happy, if you ever want to flip sides on the argument, I'm pretty sure each of us can live on either side. So
Yeah.
so when you say science doesn't answer why, but does why even exist? Is why just a human construction? So when I think about the laws of physics, right? The force
Hmm.
of gravitation is F equals gmm over r squared, and
Hmm.
F equals ma is just a force is mass times acceleration.
Hmm.
Even the concept of why, does that even exist?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, yeah, at the end of the day, in terms of spirituality, it's ultimately an experience, right? And so, um, it would be watching a great, I don't know, playing an amazing game, but somebody else has never played it before, right? I don't know, Breath of the Wild, right? It's an amazing game. It's creative. It's like an open world. But if someone has never played on a computer before, just Pong or something like that, right? And you're trying to tell them this is the greatest thing ever, and they're like, how can it be greatest thing ever? You know, games are just things moving around on the screen, and there's no purpose in it. How can you find joy or creativity on it? It's just whatever. You can come up with arguments about explaining things and why something might be better or not, but unless someone's kind of experienced that, it's hard to fully um engage that person in what you're talking about sometimes
So,
too. But
so
I also understand what you mean. Yeah, that even sort of Yeah, I'd love to ask you too. Like, what do you think is the answer to that question? Like, does why matter?
Yeah, so I
Um,
mean, let me first just see if I understood you,
yeah,
because I think
yeah,
it's a really great answer. So like, if we look
hmm
at Breath of the Wild, Breath of
yeah,
the Wild is a series of, it's software, right? So it's just a roadmap of electrons traveling through gates that
yeah,
then displays random pixels on a screen, produces random, no, not random, but non-random pixels on a screen, non-random auditory vibrations through a speaker in
hmm
a pattern. That's all Breath of the Wild is. That's like, if we look
yeah,
at the literal, like, what is it, right? So if I were to ask a scientist, what is Breath of the Wild? Well, not philosophically, I mean the video game, right? So like, you could argue that very
yeah,
technically.
hmm
And what I'm sort of hearing in your answer is that there is a dimension of human experience and existence that
hmm
is not captured by a literal scientific representation of the world, the universe, or a video game.
Yeah, I think that's you put it nicely or nicer than I did. Yes, yes, that is
Right. So
yeah.
even if we were to say that okay, the why doesn't exist, what I'm kind of hearing you say is like, okay, fine, but then we see the evidence of the importance of meaning for human beings if we play a video game. Because when
hmm
you're observing a human existence, for whatever reason, there's some weird component that makes
hmm
it subjectively more than all of these pixels on a screen or auditory vibrations. Human beings live in an existence where we're able to extract some.
Like reason with them in terms of like, oh, you're depressed. I mean, cognitive behavioral therapy is a lot about reasoning through things, right? But then I think we also understand that there is sort of this relational aspect of what we do, right? That attachment and attachment trauma, and how we carry ourselves as therapists or um, in psychodynamic psychotherapy, like, yeah, what that relationship is like and what those dynamics are like. There is a quality there that in some sense is subjective in that experience, but it also is grounded in neuroscience in other senses too, in the sense that like how we grew up with trauma and like caretakers, they really do rewire our brains and the expression of genes in our brains and being in a relationship with a positive, I guess, like, or yeah, like in a therapy environment or even God per se, those things can also rewire things on a neuroscience pathway, even though it's not the same kind of like sort of just like the reasoning through of things. I don't know if I'm
Yeah,
making
yeah.
sense.
So I think I've got a question, which I wonder if
Yeah.
it'll. I think I'm getting what you're saying. So let me
hmm
just kind of ask in a couple of different ways, and I'm happy to answer questions that you have too. I know you asked me what my answer was to that, but if it's okay, we'll follow
Yeah.
this tangent for now.
Sure.
So like,
Yeah.
here's basically what I'm curious. Okay, so like, we're both
Mhm.
psychiatrists, right? So I'm a psychiatrist. I come to you and I say, my homie Dr. Shu, I have a patient who is depressed. How do I
Mhm.
understand the therapeutic value of hearing the voice of God? Right? So if we've got a bunch of people in the world right now, depression is on the rise, religiosity is also on the decline, right? So we have the
Mhm.
most number of atheists. So like, people can attribute the worsening of mental illness to all kinds of factors. I think technology is a huge part of it, but you could also you can definitely see an inverse correlation between religiosity and mental illness. Like,
Mhm.
I'm talking about across the population. So highest number of atheists exists on the planet today that have ever existed, and also I
Mhm.
think, and then also highest rate of mental illness. Now, I'm not. A lot of people will hear that statistic and say, this guy is saying God is necessary to be mentally healthy. I'm not saying that. Remember that these are
Right.
correlations. They can be completely coincidental. Correlations do not
Mhm.
imply causation.
Mhm.
So it's not that loss of God means that people are mentally ill. But when I hear your story. Like what I'm really curious about, because like you're a psychiatrist, right? Like, so how do you understand? So you've been through therapy, you go through treatment. I don't think you're like a religious nut. How do you understand the therapeutic value of like God talking to you when you're deeply suicidal?
It's a great question. And I think one thing that, we as a field don't do a great job about explaining is that like voices, inner voices, is not all pathology. I think we sometimes over psychopathologize voices. And so as like delusions, and that can cause all sorts of like mishaps and very unfortunate. I have a story I could share
Yeah,
about
yeah.
that was kind of unfortunate where I was working with this lady. I'll, obviously de-identify as needed, but like I was working with a lady who was seen praying in the emergency room, right? And was felt like they were talking to God. And a nurse saw that, told one of the doctors, "Hey, this person is responding to internal stimuli. I think she's probably psychotic." And this is someone who did not speak English all that well, and had communication was challenging. The mental health professional came in, told her that she had psychosis. She got really upset and started to argue about it. Kind of got loud, and it got a little bit, you know, heated. Uh, Ended up getting restrained. Got admitted to the inpatient floor, and then Child Protective Services was called in to question whether or not this person should have custody of her kids going forward. Um, yeah, I think things like that are kind of missed opportunities if we think about any spiritual thing like voices or spiritual experiences as delusion per se, and or as like a psychotic experience. And I think that I think we over psychopathologize that aspect of it, and that can cause danger. And I think you also have to understand like what is mental health or mental illness, right? Like these these are symptoms that we talk about: depression, anxiety, psychosis. These are all symptoms we talk about to try to understand what's going on in someone's brains that's causing dysfunction, right, in their lives. So, I mean, I work with a lot with schizophrenia, bipolar, all sorts of things. Oh, by the way, I should have said this earlier. All these opinions are mine and do not represent any institution that I work for, obviously. But these are all mine. But what was I saying? We have symptoms that sort of correlate with what we think is going on in brains. We make diagnoses based on that, and we kind of think about like what causes dysfunction, right? And so, you think about delusions that happen in schizophrenia or bipolar. Delusions like, oh, like the FBI is after me and wanting to kill me and things like that. What you see is that as people engage more with these delusional content, they become more and more isolated. You also see in neuroimaging, like more brain inflammation. And literally, people with schizophrenia die earlier than other. And there's all sorts of factors. I'm not saying that this is purely because of their disease. There's all sorts of socioeconomic factors and cardiac and all this sorts of stuff. All to say is having a delusion is not just not mentally healthy, but like unhealthy, but it physically too. Like being in a psychotic illness is physically and mentally just not good for the human body, right? And so we think about when we think about these symptoms in that light, like what is mental illness, like how do we frame these things? Then that I feel like that kind of helps us understand some of these symptoms better too. Like, is this a voice that that someone has that's telling them to go kill themselves or go like jump off the roof? Hey, that seems problematic. Like that's in line with like what we would say is a mental illness. So we call it MDD, major depressive disorder with psychotic features, right? If somebody comes in and is like, I just had this experience where I feel just really loved by this God of the universe. And
We
oftentimes that's a psychedelic experience, right? And so,
or we'd call
yeah.
that mania with psychotic features.
Yes, yes, we could call it. Yes, yes, true, true, yes. So
Right? Because
it,
if it's
yeah,
like, oh
there's definitely a
yeah,
lot. Yeah, that's
God is
mania with
talking to me and
psychotic
I
features.
feel
Yeah,
great.
yeah. I have another story about just that one too. If we, I don't
No,
know how we
but
are.
finish your broader point. So you were saying like, if someone comes
Oh,
in and
yeah,
has a
yeah,
positive hallucination or
yeah.
delusional experience, like
Hmm.
you were talking
Yeah,
about.
so if somebody has like, if somebody comes up to you and it's like, hey, like I had this experience with God where I just feel loved, or hey, I just took some LSD and I just feel really connected. And if a doctor tells them, bro, you got to be on Haldol, injectable monthly, we're really missing something here in our field if we're treating these things as just purely psychosis. And I definitely have talked to folks. I having gone to a school, attending Johns Hopkins, where there was all sorts of buzz around psychedelics, a lot of like the forefront folks, but then also a lot of people who were very against it at the time when I was there. Yeah, I know folks who would call these experiences delusional toxicosis, like the experience of like being with God, and Freud himself too, would talk about some of these like maladaptive response, negative coping responses, or for like certain faith beliefs, or like escapism for stuff like that, for other kind of Eastern practices, and so. I think we are missing something here. If, as a society, we're just slapping everything that is beyond the observable world as psychotic, and not thinking about like what is actually good for our patients, what is actually good for our society, and like what is in the realm of like reason and experience. I don't know.
Yeah.
So
So let
I'll
me
end my
just
PowerPoint there. Thank you.
take a
Thank
second
you.
to respond, and then I still
Yeah.
want to go back to the earlier question of like, how do you understand the therapeutic value of like hearing the voice of God, right? And because I think
Okay.
that begs other questions of like, if we say that hearing the voice of God has a lot of therapeutic value, does that mean that we as mental health professionals, right? So if we say that, I guess we're going here now. So like, here's kind of what I'm thinking. So you were a 13-year-old suicidal kid and you heard the voice of God. I'm noticing that at least in terms of your narrative, and maybe that's retrospective, maybe you've kind of reconstructed, that's probably what happened, right? So you reconstructed a narrative of your life where that really does seem like a tipping point, though. You started to have functional improvement from 13 to 16. You're more social, more successful in terms of extracurriculars. Your grades are getting better, right? You wound up, it sounds like, going to med school at Johns Hopkins and doing residency at Harvard. So like you did pretty well, right? And the turning point was like hearing the voice of God. And so like I'm still kind of curious, like how, like, as a mental health professional, when you look back on your life, like what is the therapeutic value? How did hearing the voice of God alter? So when we talk about schizophrenia, we talk about they die earlier because the trajectory of their life changes, right? So you were going like this, and the second you get diagnosed with schizophrenia, like things level off, you start to do poorly. How did hearing the voice of God, as a clinician, how do you look at how that altered the course of your life? Are we talking significant alteration, small alteration, no alteration? Are these two things independent? Or was this really like, okay, you heard the voice of God, you were transformed, and it significantly altered the outcomes and the trajectory of your diagnosis and pathological process?
Yeah. It's a good question. And what I would say is that I don't think hearing the voice of God, that experience itself, I don't think it significantly altered a lot of parts of my life. Like I still felt depressed. I still had, I don't think it was like an ego dissolving experience by any means. But I think what it did is it gave me some openness and curiosity into something that I previously was not
Hmm.
open and curious about. In that there was maybe a spiritual experience or something going on in that realm of things that I just was completely against or closed off to or fearful of, I don't know, whatever the heck you, yeah,
So
call it.
so I mean I'm
I
trying
think
to
it's the
make things
openness.
I'm trying to make
Yeah.
things binary, but what I'm basically hearing from you
Mhm.
is that, I mean, I'm not hearing that God saved your life, or that God cured your depression or anything near that. I'm actually hearing that,
Mhm.
if anything, maybe it induced, you said curiosity and openness, makes me think about, the phrase neuroplasticity, or the term neuroplasticity,
Mhm.
and that
Sure.
is a mechanism of action. So like curiosity and neuroplasticity and openness, I think those three things go together.
Yeah.
Um, and so okay, that helps. So I'm kind of
Yeah.
hearing that what it really did is just created openness.
That moment, that experience created openness that there could be an existence of a spiritual realm or a being. I think later in life, not later in life, but like when I was like 18, about to go to college, and when I had decided, to accept Jesus into my life as Lord and Savior, I felt like that was a huge experience for me. And again, it didn't solve all my problems, but a personal relationship with God did for me have a therapeutic effect, and I've definitely worked with many folks. Like, obviously, I draw a clear ethical line in my clinical practice, but I definitely have talked to folks who where where faith or spirituality was a positive thing for them as well. And I think we see that a lot as well. In sort of the risk factors for suicide and that sort of screening that we do, spirituality is maybe a protective factor there too, and I can imagine why. I don't know if this is making sense, but
Yeah. How do you imagine that a spirituality is a protective factor? So like, let's say that the data says that, which
Mm,
I mean, I'm not familiar with that, but let's just assume that that's true for a moment. I think I wouldn't be
yeah.
surprised if I had to. If this is a multiple choice test and I had to circle an answer, I'd say that it is a protective factor, but not for everybody. Whatever. So I'm curious, how do you think that spirituality, what do you think is the mechanism of action through which spirituality, and you said that when you accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior in your life, that did have a therapeutic benefit. So explain to me the mechanism of action of accepting Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and what that does to you therapeutically. Like, how does that work? Like, what does that do, bro? What
Excellent,
does that even mean? I don't
excellent
know what that
question.
means.
Okay, so I think if you look at just like, let's talk about the studies for a moment. Like if you look at just like mental health outcomes across like religion versus secularism, they're not different. There's the incidence of depression, is similar across like spiritual practices versus like if you don't have any at all, atheism. Um, what does seem to be therapeutic is engaging in community. Like for example, like when they does surveys of folks, like and trying to tease out if there was any sort of like positive effect of like their religious practice. It seemed to be like going out, singing together, going out to church, community groups, some kind of like connectedness, this social connectedness aspect can be therapeutic in and of itself. And I think in a world where we are sort of very isolated, I think Jonathan, oh God, what's his last name? He wrote like Anxious Generation or like, and Coddling of the American Mind. He would kind of argue that like we kind of have this like hole that in humanity, this isolation, and that we need to go out and like, touch grass or like, but really just like connect, sing songs together, like do things that are like, sort of on this like deeper spiritual sense. Obviously, I don't think he's like a religious person, but just like this kind of like communal aspect, I think is really part of the importance of it. And then, I don't know if you were going to think about also just, therapeutically. I mean, imagine this, okay, Alec.
Okay.
Um, uh, Imagine like you grew up with like the most perfect parents
Okay.
and had a completely positive and loving relationship
Okay.
and everything was just perfect. Would that have changed your life versus like how things were otherwise?
Absolutely.
Right. And what therapeutic sense would that have given you if like you were to say be in the presence of like the most loving and perfect parents growing up? What would be like the
So
therapeutic
I
value?
think to begin with, the answer is broad. To begin with, I think it would have improved my attachment style. So
Okay.
I think I was somewhat avoidantly attached growing up.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I think I would have had a secure attachment style cause me all kinds of problems when I was in college and tried to date. And so I think that's the probably like if we're talking about, if I had a different set of parents, how would that have changed? That's a big one. But I think there's a lot
Hmm.
of other stuff like emotional regulation skills, EQ, like much like yourself, I was the uh, first child of immigrant parents, so I was second generation. And so there was a lot of
Hmm.
stuff about emotions, self understanding, pressure, lack of acceptance, very conditional acceptance, a lot of comparison, a lot of like, don't be you, be someone else. And I had,
Hmm.
for the most part, pretty loving parents. So
Yeah.
I had, on balance, I think a relatively healthy upbringing.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think that those are like two or three really big things. And then
Hmm.
I do wonder if I actually had perfect parents, if that would also be harmful in some ways, because I think that there are kind of like what you alluded to, your parents were the way that they were because that was the adaptation they needed to survive in their environment. Now, when your
Hmm.
environment changed, the environment that you grew up in and changed, some of the lessons that they learned started to become maladaptive and harmful when they were applied to you, caused a lot of
Yeah.
suffering. So I think if I
100%.
had the perfect parents, I wonder if I would not be as successful because on some deep level, even though it took me a roundabout way to get there, I think I strive for excellence in what I do, not for the status that I think was quite as important as it was to my parents. But so I also
Hmm.
wonder if having the perfect parents would be harmful in a different way, and we take for granted what flawed parents are able to give us. But I'd say EQ skills and attachment style are probably the first two things. And then maybe with some amount of self-regulation and really teaching me to like to study instead of just telling me that I needed to do it. Like all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff I think would have been very different.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe arguably you wouldn't be where you are right now
I don't
if
think I
you
would. I think
would if you
either
had
I'd be an author or a physicist, one of the two.
author or a physicist. That'd
Or
be
maybe
pretty
something else in the artistic field.
artistic. Okay. Pretty very curious to see what that outlook would come up with too.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think I relate a lot to that in the sense that like yeah, obviously I didn't have perfect parents and I'm very glad sort of I'm very grateful for how I grew up. But the therapeutic value of having a relationship with a loving father or loving parents or whatever is I agree with everything you said. And so like empathy, right? I did not know what empathy was, and I realized this was actually pretty normal development
Yeah.
for me. I just thought like growing up, I was like, I can only prove I exist. Maybe I'm God, or like, how do I know other people's emotions or feelings exist? Maybe my goal in life is just to troll people and to like find amusement in it, and I don't know, play video games, and like that was like my mindset. And I think at that time, I thought I was like, oh, like I'm like this is such a cool realization. And then looking back, I feel like it is something actually pretty common to like have this kind of viewpoint early on that like you're yeah that you that not having sort of like that empathy, but that in developing sort of sense of others and empathy later on in life, I probably developed it later and sort of later than if again we posited that perfect parents, but empathy is something that I developed through having a relationship with God.
How does that work? Because now I'm confused because, and I mean, I have a answer that if you ask me the question I'm about to ask you, I would have an answer for it. But
Yeah,
like, so when I think about the development of empathy and why I think about, so you're analogizing God to perfect parents, is that right? Like, so you asked me that question about
I
perfect
think
parent.
it's an imperfect. I think it's kind of weird to anthropomorphize like
Okay,
this being as God or this God of the universe, and
but
to like something, but this is like the only kind of like, yeah, I think it's just an analogy, and it's a
Yeah,
very
so
imperfect one.
I'm
Yeah,
confused because like, okay, let's say that like I can understand learning empathy from something that bluntly interacts with you, right? So
yeah,
what I'm really curious about is like how can a relationship with God like literally like how does that teach you empathy? Because I mean, to my knowledge, and maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe I mean, you said you've had mystical experiences. So, like, I mean, is like God relating to you in a way that is somewhat analogous to parents teaching their children the capacity of empathy? Like, how does like what's the like how does that work, man?
yeah. It's a lot of these questions. I'm going to start with like I don't know
Okay,
fully.
yeah, yeah,
You know,
obviously,
and even empathy as a construct and like how that gets developed. And the neuroscience behind it. I think I would still say like I don't know fully the
yeah, yeah,
answers around all these things, but um, I think one, obviously, like being part of a community
yeah,
and feeling and a connectedness to that, that's going to teach, unless, your goal is to go into that community and start trolling like that, being part of a community and wanting to like bond with people will teach some sense of like emotional regulation
sure,
and empathy, sure. But another part of my kind of, I guess you could call this mystical experience with God is that like when I pray or when I get into sort of like sort of this like more mystical prayer or like a presence of God, like I truly experience what I call like the heart of God or like the Holy Spirit, and like I truly experience like the nature around me, the people around me, and how
mm,
they feel, and the world and the universe. I can't really explain it
sure,
fully. It's like I just I don't know, but I
makes sense.
just feel this like connectedness, and so how and so it's an experience, right? And like it comes down to an experience, and like um once you experience empathy, it doesn't mean I'm necessarily an empathic person just right then and there, and like I'm going to start like empathizing left and right. But once I've experienced what empathy is like, and like the feelings of like a hurting person and those people that are like oppressed or like by society or even the church or whatever it is, like then I kind of know like, wow, this is like the heart of God. And like this is an experience now that like I experience more and more in my life where yeah, whatever, yeah, I don't know if this is making
Yeah, so
sense,
so let
but
me tell you what I heard or how I
mhm,
understood what you said. So what
mhm,
I'm hearing is that there is part of your spiritual or religious experience, you do
mhm,
have moments or maybe longer. I'm what I mean to say is that it is not a necessarily a permanent state. You have times where you feel something called the heart of God, and then that heart of God is expansive, loving, non-judgmental. Now I'm injecting stuff, right? So I'm adding on my
sure,
own interpretations, but so you have this experience of like unconditional love, let's call it that, right? You get this like sense of
sure,
divine love. And then even if you grew up in an environment where like you did not receive unconditional love, in these mystical states you receive this unconditional love, and then I think it makes perfect sense how this would model for you what empathy is like, right? So then it's like, okay, this is in me on some level. I'm receiving this on some level. So someone else is being kind to me. And then now I've learned this skill. There's probably also a component of, and I think empathy is a really great example on your part, because I think it's like, a lot of these transcendental mystical experiences, whether we're talking about psychedelics or spirituality induced, are ego death is a big part of them, or dissolution of the ego, right? And you talk about connectedness. And so
yeah,
as our ego kind of dissolves, I think one of the things that we found from studies on meditation is that as we become more egoless, our compassion, which is sort of the term that's used more in the Eastern karmic traditions, our compassion for other beings exists. So we feel more connected.
yeah,
So I could totally see how, and it makes me really think about object relations actually, where like, is it the parent itself that is creating the mental health improvement, the sense of empathy, or is it the way that we relate to this external object, that the way we interact with it the way that we face it is actually more responsible for the change within us than what the thing itself is doing. I know we're getting a little bit abstract, but you know, if we look at object relations, it's like, it's not technically what your mom does. It's the way that you perceive, interact, and relate to your mom that ultimately has the biggest effect.
100%. Yeah.
And so if we really take things pretty far, what we could even presume then is that the object doesn't even need to exist. And I'm thinking about one of my psychoanalytic supervisors who was like, you know, explaining to me that the basic problem is that we form all these conclusions on things that don't really exist. Right.
Sure.
These are all like fictions in our mind. They're interpretations. They are, you know, we remember this one moment from our upbringing. That's the object. So it doesn't even have to be real. And most of the time it's not, is what you learn in, or not real in a tangible sense, which sort of then makes sense. Okay. So like God is maybe some, you know, you could interpret a relationship with God through object relations theory, which would make a lot of sense. I'm sure that's been done a ton.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. And yeah, I think you're kind of getting at like this sort of default mode network, these series of like identity statements and these rules and the things that we kind of live by. And a lot of this, a lot of that has to do with how we perceive the world and how we interpret that, and that can develop into sometimes an overactivity of that can develop into depression, anxiety, and that sort of thing. And these, I guess like when you're in a place where you're in, I guess, in the awe of like, I guess, a God of the universe, like these things just, they dissolve in some sense. But then, you know, in therapy too, we also work a lot towards like, you know, I do some work with like internal family systems as well, and things like that. Like what we see is that when you work towards sort of unhinging some of these overactive managers or like default mode kind of things, they're not quite synonymous, but I feel like I kind of in my mind kind of see a lot of similarities between them. Yeah, overactive managers, you work through like exiles and these things. What you have is not just like a blank slate inside of you after you do that, and then now you just have to reprogram everything. But there seems to be like this level of curiosity, compassion, like love, and these things that start kind of emerging like once these defenses and once these like things sort of, and these like these rigid thought patterns start to dissolve. There seems to be like more of this openness and curiosity. I wonder if there is some like relationship with what goes on there with what goes on in the mystical spiritual experience. I don't know, but
So I get, I mean, I guess what I'm hearing there is like, so as we remove all of the layers of conditioning, as we remove layers of conditioning, there's some positive valence stuff that starts to float to the surface. Right. So as we like remove the overactive manager, we're not left with neutrality. We're left with more compassion, like some goodness kind of directional stuff.
That's and you know, I think I was hearing someone, I forgot which psychologist was talking about this, but like I think we talked on stream about like the abyss, right? Like this sort of like once you start examining what's deep inside, right, and you just kind of sit there, and maybe in meditation like this happens, and like but like there's this sort of existential abyss or this emptiness, or sometimes fear and anxiety and things like that. Like there's a lot of like sort of this resistance to want to sit with that. The abyss is a kind of scary place to be. But then, you know, what this psychologist was arguing, I think his name was Dan Allender or something like that. What he was arguing was that like what people are actually more scared of than sitting with the abyss is what happens after, like the human potential, like, and like what, you know, what can be unlocked in us to, you know, in terms of like how we can, I don't know, thrive in society and love and compassion. Like there's, that there, after you do work through that and sit through that, that there is some potential to really work towards the flourishing of society or something like that, you know? So, I thought that was kind of interesting.
I'm kind of curious. Do you, so I'm not hearing, so even though you've had a profound set of religious experiences, it sounds like you've accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior.
Mhm.
When I really ask you about mechanisms and stuff, what I'm really hearing you kind of say is that there are some very discernible, concrete mechanisms about social connectedness, social support that are associated with religiosity or spirit, like
Sure.
community,
Yeah.
basically, social capital,
Mhm.
things like that. And so would you recommend to your patients that they engage with the dimension of religiousness or spirituality as a form of as a part of their therapeutic process? Or are you pretty like agnostic there?
I think, I really let my patients kind of guide things like that. If I always ask my patients like, hey, would you have any spiritual experience or religious background? And whatever they say, I respect that. If it's someone who I think, who is really isolated, right? And just like not willing to connect with anything, but they're highly on the kind of spiritual stat, but very low on the relational stat, I guess, of things. Like, then I'd be like, hey, like, do you want to find people who think and believe like you? Like, would that be helpful? And so, like, yeah, let's explore that a bit. Like, what would that be like to be around people who think and believe like you, who worship like you, you know? And so, I definitely think that yeah, social connectedness is definitely something that, and community integration, we call it as well, in terms of like seeing people thrive beyond the sort of like the DSM-5 that we think about. Like I feel like these are important things to bring up that we don't always think about as clinicians, but I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I'm not hearing you advocate for a particular religious or spiritual tradition at all, and also not even that they should do something, right? So it's more that for some people it's well suited for them. It does sound like there are some really interesting mechanisms at play, and maybe we can kind of dive more into that because I'm kind of curious. For all these mystical experiences that you are describing, there's a lot of interest in psychedelics now. So, what do you think is the relationship between psychedelic experience, religious experience? Are these two things interchangeable? What do you think about that?
It's an excellent question. I think the big answer is I don't know. I don't. I think there's a lot. I've been thinking a lot about this too, and I love to hear kind of your thoughts on it. But I think I see a lot of similarities between the spiritual experience that I've had, or other people of different other religious experiences have, and that of the psychedelic experience. And I think at the very least, the experience itself, there seems to be like a huge amount of overlap with that. Um, and I think one of the guys, I think he was also at Hopkins, Bill Richards, he would kind of talk about this idea of like how our mind is kind of like this antenna, right? Or we have this antenna to like interact with the spiritual beyond like our sort of physical world, right? And um, that like what psychedelics maybe does is it kind of like through the serotonin mechanism and a whole sorts of cascades of things that we're still trying to understand, somehow turns this on. That like, it turns us on to experience something in the beyond or in the spiritual that we maybe were closed off to otherwise. When I hear things like that, I do think a lot about the experience that I've had and sort of like, yeah, that turning on moment or like that openness moment. And I'm like, that is pretty darn interesting. And I think one of the first papers that came out about psychedelics at Hopkins was on like, it wasn't about like, oh, let's do psychedelics to cure PTSD. And there's been a lot of awesome stuff with that, or more with MDMA than classical. But like, yeah, but more like, but it was like about like how can psychedelics create these mystical experiences, and that was like the title of the paper or something like that. And it was just like, I think there is like sort of this like this realm of things, I guess this mystical experience that we kind of are closed off to as like a mental health field, that there can be a lot of maybe this potential. I don't know. But I think we also have to be really careful ethically, if one as we're doing psychedelics, to be sort of not partial. Yeah, anyway. I
What do
already
you mean by
forgot your
that?
original question. I'm kind of just meandering on. What do I mean by that?
What do we need to be
Well,
careful about ethically with psychedelics?
I think a number of things. I think one thing is to the neutrality of the approach. I think Matthew Johnson, who was really a forefront and great thinker in psychedelics, and he talks a lot about sort of this neutrality of as you're doing psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, like there's folks who like have a Buddha statue in the room or tell people like, hey, this is going to be the most important thing that you'll experience, or you'll meet God, or the Holy Spirit will fill you and you'll like meet Jesus here. Okay, let's go into this psychedelic experience. I think like one thing that we know for sure about the psychedelic experience, especially like a psilocybin, things like that, is that like there is a lot of this sort of like sort of suggestibility aspect of it,
Hmm.
which is why set and setting is so important. Creating the safe environment and sort of this neutral space. Um, and so I think we have to be very careful because these are real. I mean, yeah, these are really powerful tools, and I think it's going to absolutely revolutionize our field. But these are really powerful tools, and I think we have to be sort of very careful with what we're willing to say or do that could change someone's course of their life or like their thinking, and like how what we do can affect that. So, and letting that be a patient-centered experience too, that they kind of get to come and drive that, if
What
that
do you
makes
mean
sense.
by, so when you say we need to be careful, like careful in what way?
Um,
Like,
I
what's
think
an
one
example
just
of not careful and what's an example of careful?
It's a good question. I think not careful would be to impress our like religious experience onto the patient while they're going through it,
We're not supposed to
or
do that
sort
as
of worldview.
therapists?
Sorry. Oh yeah, actually, surprise, surprise. Yeah, you're not supposed to do that. But believe it or not, I think there is like this subtlety around how folks might be doing it. And so yes, you're not supposed to do it. Other things you're not supposed to do is take advantage of your patients in front of you. But there's been some problems with. I
Yeah.
mean, this is minimal, right? I mean, yeah. But there is. I mean, if we're just focusing on sort of like what the things to be careful of, I think set and setting, staying neutral, not impressing, sort of beliefs, and letting the patient sort of like guide, sort of like also like where they're gonna go with it while you give an open space and like a safe space for it. I think I'm sure other folks who work a lot closer with like MDMA and PTSD or psilocybin depression, could talk even more about sort of the phases around it. And
Hmm.
I've been close to the studies, but I haven't been the one doing it at this point. But so yeah,
Yeah.
that's sort of partly, yeah, I sort of part of the challenges of it.
So,
What do you think?
um, I, th- I'm going to share what I think in a minute, if that's okay.
Okay.
I'm gonna go back and answer all the questions you've asked, but I have a couple more questions for you, if that's cool.
Yeah.
So, like, so this is gonna sound, so like when people have psychedelic experiences, like, do you think, so first of all, what do you think is the overlap with, like, do you think that this is basically like, are these similar things? Like, if I take, let's say, psilocybin, am I connecting to God in the same way or a similar way or in the same ballpark way as when you have, a mystical experience? Like, do you think that religious experiences, spiritual experiences, and psychedelic experiences are phenomenologically like similar? Like, do you think like the same thing is happening?
Um, the answer is I don't know, but I'm very curious about that, and I
Okay.
think they could very well be the same experience. And I certainly have talked to a lot of folks who described the experience to me after coming back from doing this in therapy or from a ayahuasca trip. And to me, it does seem like the same kind of spiritual experience, that they are in sort of this place. But yeah, I think it's I don't know. Yeah, I can't say for sure, but
Sure.
yes, I think there's a lot of, people, they did the Good Friday experiment in like Mars Chapel, like in Boston, where they gave like folks who have like like divinity students at the time, like religious experiences, psychedelics, and like a lot of them described that their spiritual experiences deepened. Obviously, it's not a controlled study and stuff like that, but they felt like, when they did take the psychedelic, that it was congruent to their spiritual experience going into it, is my understanding, and that it enhanced it. And then there was a guy who I think had like a psychotic experience or something like that. But yeah, but then I also wonder, I don't know. The answer is I don't know.
So like you're familiar with machine elves?
Yes, machine elves.
Can we
Those
talk
machine
about
elves.
machine elves for a second? Can you tell us what machine elves are?
Oh man, machine elves. Okay. Um, how I imagine machine elves is like, and say you like kind of land. Let's say we're talking right now, right? Human to human, stuff like that. Let's say we like were to land in Super Mario World, and Toad Temsel comes up to you and you're like, "Welcome to Mushroom Kingdom."
Okay.
It starts kind of like, kind of showing you compassion, and maybe like even not necessarily talking to you, but like surrounding you with love, and they don't look like Toad from Mario, but they really look like, machine elves. These are, stepping back a bit, these are sort of shared experiences that folks who have used DMT seem to have across different independent sort of experiences with it, right? And what it seems to be is that like people experience sort of like compassion, love. It's kind of like this telekinetic communication with these machine elves. Sometimes these machine elves sort of take people onto this like journey where it like opens up their realm of, I don't know, consciousness, or I'm probably not using that word correctly in that sense, but like like showing them something about the universe that is really difficult to explain after you step out of it. And kind of, I've heard one person say like they kind of talk like a I don't know, like thou, like using like thee and thou, and like like that kind of like I shall show you thy mushroom kingdom.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's there seems to be a shared experience, which is really fascinating. It really is
Yeah.
really
So
interesting.
so
Yeah.
what I kind of understand is like, so basically when people do DMT, right? So on the one hand, you kind of mentioned that when you mentioned that study with divinity students in Boston, when you use psychedelics, sometimes they give you experiences that are congruent with your experience of life. So if I'm like Christian and maybe I use something like psilocybin, I'm going to hear from Jesus. If I am Hindu and I use psilocybin, I'm going to hear from Krishna.
So I actually would push back on that.
Okay.
That's yeah. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that there's definitely can be instances of incongruence. There is more randomness than it. For example, okay, there was an interview with someone who came in with sort of Eastern psychology, Buddhist, more on the sort of atheist side, and saw Jesus on the cross while using, I forgot if it was LSD or psilocybin, and felt like he was the one who put him there. That's pretty incongruent, I
Yeah,
would
sure.
say, because this
Yeah.
person was not,
And
not into that stuff.
so
But then after that happened, was like, dude, who's this dude that I put on the cross, and then ended up believing? Yeah. So I, but then there's other folks who are Christian and they go into it and they might experience something completely dark or different, or maybe
so
they
that's
end up
interesting.
not being Christian
So
after losing,
if
not necessarily not being Christian, but losing
if I
or
had to
having a
ask,
different.
okay, so that's interesting. So I would, okay, so then let's forget about that. I think it's because what I was about to say is then we also have some of these experiences with things like DMT. I think I think it's DMT. So where people who use DMT have a common experience, right? So irrespective of what your background is, what your religious background is. So you're saying that there's more incongruence than people may think, than I was suggesting. Fair enough. But then we also know on the flip side, there is actually has nothing to do with what you believe or what your background is, that human beings will have very similar experiences. So you use DMT and you will encounter, or a lot of humans will encounter, what they describe as machine elves, right? And we call it that because their capacity to put into language what they experience, there's like a drop off. Like we can't adequately describe. And so they'll use the term elf because it kind of is like sort of like an elf, but it's also like this little robotic creature, right? Like it's like a robotic, it's not a toad, it's like an elf, but it's like a mechanical elf. And that these mechanical elves are generally speaking like positive, right? They like you, they're friendly, they'll take you on journeys, which also are mind bending and whatnot, and then you kind of come back. But people will consistently describe encounters with machine elves. And DMT, I remember looking at one small study that looked at, like something like 34 patients, and found that like over 90% of them, a very common experience with DMT is encountering some kind of otherworldly being. So you encounter something that's like not human, not God, but just other things out there that or whatever. So I'm kind of curious, like when so you've had mystical experiences yourself. You've studied at Hopkins and Harvard. You understand neuroscience. You understand RCTs. You understand neurochemistry. You're a clinician. You've dealt with psychosis, right? You know what delusions look like. You know what psychosis kind of looks like symptomatically. Like, what do you think is going on here? Are these things, do they like actually exist? Is this a spiritual antenna that we're tuning things into? Are these figments of our imagination? Are these random firings of our serotonergic system that then get interpreted by like other parts of our cortices? Like, what do you think is going on here? And I know that your first answer is going to be, I don't know. So what do you think?
So you already know my first answer. And I think just medding a bit, I think one good stance to just have in mind across all these things is I think Roland Griffiths, who's other Hopkins dude, rest in peace, and was a huge psychedelics researcher. He would talk about this idea of a negative capability, right? Where it's like, we really want to see things in absolutes. And like, this is how it is. And this is why, this is how the way works. This is how God is, this, or like, this is what, And so like, we want to see, these are what machine elves are. And I feel like we want to see things in absolutes. And I think having sort of, it's important to have like absolutes as well in life and like seeking truth and stuff like that. But I think it's also important to have like openness around like, we just don't know. There's so much uncertainty and mystery. We may not ever, as humans, maybe one day, but we may not ever have the technology to understand out of the universe, machine elves and things like that. It may not have a definitive answer. And so I think having a sort of like negative capability around it, and like me, like I question, I wrestle with doubt all the time about like, what do I believe? Do I believe in this or that, or what this pastor says, or what this political whatever? Anyway, we won't go into that. But so anyway, I'm just gonna start with that. But what do I think is going on with the machine elves? I'm straddling between two things, right? One is like this sort of biological phenomenon, sort of like this chemical interaction with the brain, creating sort of the dreamlike state, and that folks are, just for some reason that chemical produces like a visual, like enhances this visual cortex and sort of our amygdala in certain ways that. This is just the human genetics experience of crashing with DMT, and bam, machine elves. Here we go, and they're gonna communicate and talk certain ways. That's how it is. Sure. Then there's a field, and I think we talked about this, Alok, where like, is there? This is where it might sound quack, but can it be more quack or unhinged than we've already been? I don't know, but like, we believe in like a spiritual space in and around. I think we talked about that there isn't just like material, and so could this be our spiritual realm? Could there be angels? Could there be machine elves or whatever? What do those represent? And I know there's, I think there's all sorts of ways people are exploring the consciousness, or like these, like, I don't know, psychonauts, and different ways that they're exploring. But there is a subset of psychonauts who are exploring these machine elves. I've never talked to one who's doing this, but I kind of imagine like an astronaut going out to space and going like, oh, what's this, like dirt on the moon, like going into and like experiencing these things. Could it be spiritual? I'm definitely open to that idea as well. And so
What
I
does that
don't
mean?
know.
Could it
I
be
have
spiritual? What do you mean by spiritual there?
Oh, like, okay. So one of the things that comes, one kind of unique-ish property, and I don't want to draw like rigid lines across these different psychedelics, but one thing that people kind of experience with like ayahuasca, like or DMT, is sort of this, like, I don't know, I forgot if the word is like hyperdimensional, or like they feel, you kind of get transported into a different dimension, right? And it goes back to this idea of like, is there another spiritual realm or dimension that we just can't experience with our eyes, our nose, our mouth, right? And like this, like, material world. Is there some kind of realm, another dimension, right? Um, Obviously, Marvel will tell us yes, but like, yeah, is there another realm? And so, like, could this be another dimension or realm we just can't sense when we're in our current conscious state, or using our our olfactory neurons and our ocular, muscles and whatever? Like, is there more? Yeah. So I'm open to that idea. So, and I wouldn't call myself a conspiracy theorist or anything like that, but sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think,
So
yeah. What do you think? What do you think, Alok?
I think I want
Yeah,
to tell you
should
what
you
I
be giving me
think.
Haldol at this point, or?
No, I don't think you need Haldol. Aripiprazole, my dude. Um,
Thank you. That's a good
let
one.
me. I'm gonna go grab my iPad and then I will tell you what I think,
Okay.
because I think
Okay.
you've asked a ton of questions. So let me just grab something, and then you keep everyone entertained.
Oh boy. Oh boy. I don't even see the chat. Um, Greetings, all Earthlings. Welcome to the mystical world of Dr. K, or as we humans call it, Healthy Gamer.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna have to. I need a second to figure this out. Can you say something?
Hello.
Okay, great. Okay.
Okay.
So, what do I think? So, first of all, thank you so much, Michael, for coming on today and sharing your perspectives with us. Like I said, I really love how, dude, you're just so knowledgeable, right? So you've had like you've gone through these trials and tribulations yourself. Like you've like studied at some of the best institutions in the world. I think I imagine you're a good clinician. Like it sounds like you really try hard. I know you've worked with a ton of different patient populations, people who are really successful, people who are veterans. You just bring so many different perspectives, and like you've done philosophical studies and RCTs and all this kind of stuff. Like you've done studies in basically every way that you can do a study. So I really just love and appreciate that about you. So let me see if I can get this going. Okay. Oh, wow. This works. Hell yeah. Okay. So now what I need to do, hold on. I'm going to have to screen share with you. So that you can see this. Okay. So you should be able to see that. And then now you're going to disappear over here. Hold on. Let me see if I can figure out something else over here. So I'm screen sharing with you, but can I? There. You can still see mine, right?
Yeah,
You can
it's
see
just
the
sort of a dark
iPad.
screen.
Yeah, it's just a black
Yeah,
screen.
yeah, dark screen with iPad icons.
Okay,
Found it.
there we go. Okay, so wow. Props to our overlay people for finally making this work where everyone can see everything and we can still see your face. Okay. So what do I think? Like, what do I think is going on? So I think let's start with pathology, right? So you started off with this point, or not start, you mentioned this point that like human beings, we tend to pathologize a lot of things in psychiatry. So it's reached the point where if you hallucinate of any kind, or if you have any sort of delusion, or if you have any kind of non-sensory based experience, we're quick to pathologize it. Mm-hmm. So I think that human beings have the capacity to experience things that are not based in a material reality. So we have the capacity to hear voices that don't exist. Now, this is a capacity that we have. So this could be a manifestation of grief. It could be adaptive in terms of like, inner voice. And so just like anything else, like we are capable of being sad and we're capable. So if we kind of think about, sadness, this is a normal range of sadness. And if people experience a lot of sadness, we call this depression. We call this mourning, right? If you are mourning someone you've lost, and this is like normal. And then if you're over here, maybe you're manic. So human beings have a normal range of things that we experience. And I think a non-sensory based awareness or subjective experience of things that don't exist is within the realm of what humans can experience. So William James talked about this a lot. I think it's a really great book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he talks about like, what is mental illness? What is psychosis? So we have like human beings have this potential to have, let's call them weird, subjective experiences. Now so the first thing is I think pathology is when this weird subjective experience becomes hyperactive or becomes abnormally active. So I'll give you just a simple example of this. So if we look at like people with schizophrenia, right? So people specifically with paranoid delusions, and I'm sure you know this, right? So like if we look at paranoid delusions, what separates people with paranoid delusions from other kinds of people who are hallucinating or being delusional? It's because the parts of their brain that form associations are hyperactive. So what do we mean by this? This means that, so if I'm walking down the street, I see Michael walking down the street and I'm like, that's just a random dude. And then I see a car drive by. There's all kinds of random stimuli in our environment. When the part of my brain that generates patterns out of random stimuli, this is the same part of our brain that can see an animal when we look at clouds. There's no animal there, but there's a part of our brain that generates patterns. When this part of our brain becomes hyperactive, we see this in paranoid delusions, they start taking all kinds of random things, like this person stopped at this traffic light, even though it was yellow and they could have gone through. That means that they're watching me. This other person was walking behind me. I stopped and I pulled out my phone, and then they sat at a park bench, right? These could be all random things. People sit down at park benches. People don't always run through yellow lights. But when this hyper association happens in a certain part of our brain, plus I have a weird subjective experience, this is what I think of as schizophrenia. Okay, so it's like we all have the capability to see God or whatever, but then when it gets combined with some amount of hyperactivity, abnormal activity in our brain with a pathologic process, it gets hijacked pathologically, just like the immune system does if we have autoimmune disease, right? Normal part of the human body can get inappropriately activated. So that's what I think is going on with people who are like hallucinating, paranoid delusions, whatever. Is like the psychosis, we have these weird subjective experiences and it can get taken over by mental illness. Now the question becomes, what is this? So there's the biological, the hard biological explanation, which is like pretty simple. It's just that, you know, like our brain sometimes does things. So I'll give you all a simple example. So let's say I have my eyes, and then I have my occipital cortex, and then I have my visual association cortex. So this is where I have a signal. The signal, I have an actual signal, and then that gets processed in a very primitive way in our visual cortex. Actually, maybe that's a better way to put it. This may all happen in the occipital cortex now that I think about it. I'm rusty. Do you know if the visual cortex is in the occipital cortex? Probably, right? And then what happens is we form associations. So when I like the way that this works neuroscientifically is if I look at a painting, I get light entering my eyes, and then I have a part of my brain that processes the visual stimulus, right? So it takes light and it generates an image for me. So this is kind of like the monitor. Like a monitor takes electrons and generates an image. But then the image is not the painting. The painting is our subjective experience. So if I say beauty, this painting is beautiful, that doesn't come from the visual cortex. That comes from the visual association cortex. So we have a separate part of our brain that gives meaning to things. So like, you know, like if I come in the door and I see roses, roses are just random flowers. They're random ass flowers, just like any other flower that exists on the planet, but we attach associations with it. So I think sometimes what could be going on with these weird subjective experiences, if we get activation of this part of the brain without this part of the brain and this part of the brain, we could get some profound spiritual experience. Possibly. Right? And this is also mediated by serotonin receptors and like whatever psychedelics activate, like whatever. So I think that there's an argument to be made that all of these weird subjective experiences are essentially false. They're artifacts and can be reduced to parts of the brain activating. And there's good arguments to this because we can sort of say, you know, if I take an electrode and I implant it over here and I start activating it, or someone has a seizure over here. So I think like the best example of this is like temporal lobe syndrome. I don't know if you like are familiar with that. Yay, nay?
Back in neurology days.
Yeah,
you start seeing visual hallucinations when you have an overactive temporal lobe.
Absolutely, right? So and people with temporal lobe syndrome are also hyper-religious and hypergraphic. So people have hypothesized that Dostoevsky like had some temporal lobe like neurological activity because they write a ton, like literally, like there's this pattern of seeing things, being spiritual, and just being fucking vomiting out books and books and books and books and books. So you can make this argument. Okay. Oh, whoops. Now, but what I think is actually going on, I fall into the spiritual antenna camp. So I think that if we really look at the brain, what's happening is our brain is ultimately an organ of perception. So, for example, so a lot of people will say like, okay, like these subjective experiences aren't real. They're created by the brain. So if I look at if I take my eyes, I have visual cortex, visual association cortex. And I do a study where I stimulate some part of my brain. I administer a psychedelic. Damn it. And then I see that I'm activating parts of my brain gets activated. Brain turns on. So if my brain turns on, people will say like, okay, this means that since I can induce it with a psychedelic, that means that it's not real. It's created by the brain. But let's use a different analogy. So if I activate the visual cortex, if I turn this on and I turn this on, even without an actual thing, I will have a subjective experience of seeing something. Make sense?
Yeah.
But just because I can artificially activate neurons and see things, or mess with neurons and not see things. So if we look at like, unilateral like hemianopia and things like that, like, all these weird like neuro conditions where we have brain damage and we have left-sided hemi-neglect and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
Just because I can tamper with the brain and create subjective experiences does not mean that light doesn't exist and that the real world doesn't exist, right? Like, duh.
Right.
Like, I can artificially stimulate this part of my brain and have a human being create a subjective experience. That doesn't mean that the world is false. This just means that our brain is capable of perceiving the world. Now, there's one big difference between the psychedelic experiences, the spiritual experiences, and the rest of the world, which is that the rest of the world has material evidence of its existence, whereas machine elves do not. Right? We have no evidence of God or machine elves or whatever. Maybe you can argue that we do, but so I think this is kind of where the rub is. But if we kind of look at it, like some people will say, like, okay, they'll sort of tip into that direction. Well, they say it's not real because we can't observe it externally. And that's where I think, we've talked about this before. I just did a whole lecture about it on Monday, actually, where on the membership side, I did something called the Weird Stuff Part 2. So these are like in our membership community, also twice, I've said, hey, y'all, I want to teach something that I just want to teach y'all, which is just weird. There's no point to it. There's no value in it. It's just, and people don't even know how to ask about it. So usually people will vote on topics, and I prepare lectures on like attachment or emotions or whatever they want to
Kind of
talk
like
about.
this conversation, just like weird stuff.
Yeah. So I was talking about like the nature of consciousness and like meditation and this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So what I think is basically going on is that our brain is capable of, like you said, there's an antenna, and we have one kind of perception that, I say one kind of perception, I think it goes a little bit deeper than that. We have non-sensory perception, let's put it that way. So we are capable of perceiving things that are not of the material world, right? So this is where we get into like qualia and phenomenology, where it's like there's stuff out there that is not reducible to like material detection. At this point, we can't materially detect it, but our brains can detect it, right? So we just have a perception that is beyond our five senses. And so when people use psychedelics, or when they meditate, or when they become psychotic, we start to perceive things that are just non-material, and that there are particular techniques that you can do that will evoke certain kinds of spiritual experiences. You can pray. And I mean, I'm going to go ahead and say, like, I'm with you, Michael, that we don't know from an objective sense, but subjectively, like, I'm pretty sure all that shit is real, man. Like, I think that there are, like, just bluntly, right? So like, I think this stuff like machine elves, like people, and I think there's a good, in a sense, scientific argument for it, which is that, see, if 100 human beings look through a telescope and they see Mars, like that consistency of human perception using a tool that enhances perception tells us about reality. It doesn't indicate falsity. Consistency of human perception, I think, tells us something. And if we really think about it, like, and this is where we get even deeper. If we sort of think about perception. How can I say this? So I think there's one fundamental problem potentially. I am a human and I have the quality of perception. I think it's actually the other way around. I think perception is the most basic quality of who we are. So if you think about how do you know you're you and you don't know you're me, it's because your perception is different. What ends when you die? Your ability to perceive ends. Right? So like the perception, I think, is the most basic aspect. So you always experience your life. Like you can, and there's a perception that is even beyond the senses, because you can perceive your perception of the senses. right? So you are aware, you can observe your capacity for sight. You can observe your capacity for sound. So the capacity for perception is ultimately like our most basic attribute of existence. This is entirely subjective. So I know this sounds kind of bizarre, but like who you and I are fundamentally subjective. It's not defined by our objective qualities, it's defined by our subjective qualities. And so I think what's going on is that when we use some of these tools, we're like amplifying some of our basic perception, and we're detecting like all this weird crap that is just not material.
Yeah. This is really fascinating. What if people come and say like, okay, so, consistent perception, that sort of as a data point. But what if the perception itself is awry? How do we know that this is the right, that what we're perceiving is like, how do we know this is like a reality that we're experiencing in this kind of spiritual realm, or if that's just my mind playing tricks on me, like a psychotic illness or like something else?
I'd push that question right back to you for anything else in existence. How do human beings know that what they are perceiving is real?
I mean, that's just back to the perception aspect, our own senses,
our
own critical thinking, our executive control.
I would say, how do we know that a rose is red?
We see it and we associate red with what other people have taught us, and that we perceive it.
So
as
I
red
think the key thing there is right? So consensus of perception is what human beings use as a basis of reality. Consensus of perception. So when my perception and your perception are shared, that's what we call scientific truth. So if I run a study and I have one result, and you run a study and you have a different result, and there's a lack of consensus, then we say that we don't know which one is real. The moment that both of us agree, it moves closer to reality. So I think consensus of human observation is the basis of our reality.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think in some sense I agree, because especially in this realm of things, you just cannot test it using like any evidence-based methods, and this is probably the best we've got. But I also, I don't know, part of my research brain is like, well then, we have all sorts of consensus trials going on, like different people thinking different things or different conspiracies, but like, is it really, have we eliminated the biases and like things like that? I'm not asking a question. It's just, I'm just telling you what's coming to mind.
I think like that. So consensus observation is the foundation of science. And I think what we say, and like, we know that in medicine, right? So let's like, okay, like, are we going to prescribe SSRIs? Why? So we are very sophisticated scientists in medicine. And the pillars of the practical application of medicine is consensus observation. That's literally what a randomized controlled trial is. Can we detect a consistent effect? Is there a consistent observation that can be made if we give someone olanzapine versus aripiprazole, right?
Yeah.
And then we have instrumentation, and this is where things get really fun, because there are some experiments that we can run so consistently that the observations are 100%. So gravity, for example, I think is like a really good example of like an experiment that you can run 1,000,000 times and you will find consistent observation. And that is what we say is reality. Right? What's our threshold? I mean, our threshold is like p less than 0.05, right? That's what it is in science, because we need a certain level of statistical probability, which is like, it's literally consistency. It's consistency that is the foundation of science.
Yeah, no, that is true. And there's imperfect science even in the science of it. Like with what we know in medical field, a lot of what there's a lot of issues sort of even in sort of research and things, papers that get retracted, or ideas that we thought were evidence-based that end up getting adjusted as we keep learning. So, yeah. What?
Thalidomide. You remember thalidomide before our day?
Oh, yes. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Anti-cancer drug.
Yeah.
Really terrible for fetuses. So, right. So we learn from our mistakes.
Yes.
Did that answer
yes.
your
And-
question? I know you asked me a couple times, like, what do I think? That's what I think about this stuff. So I think,
Oh, 100%. Yeah, yeah. And yeah, that's fascinating. I think the first half, I'm like, yeah, this makes sense. The second half, I'm like, whoa, this is something I have to chew on for
Fair enough.
a bit, because it's like, yeah, no, that's really fascinating.
cool.
But yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on. Any last questions before we wrap up?
No, no questions. But I appreciate the conversation.
Likewise, man.
I felt like we were just hanging out at a cafe somewhere, but
Yeah, and I
you know,
remember.
just
So
gotten
for
up.
people who Michael alluded to one or two conversations. So Michael and I went to dinner maybe like about a year ago, and like we were just having a great conversation. I was just thinking like, man, this should be streamed, and that's what because it was just you're just so broadly studied. Like you just have so many different perspectives and I tend to I think you kind of what you call it, the something about negativity, the capability of
A
negativity.
negative capability.
Yeah. Right. So like I tend to put my money down. I'm like, yeah, I think
Well, you're a
it's real. Like,
streamer.
I
I
think
feel you
machine
gotta
elves are
kind
real.
of have to put a stance
Yeah.
somewhere.
Right.
And I feel
and
like
Michael is like one of these
those are your
guys that's like, oh, like I'm a psychiatrist. Like, oh, it's like all in the meaning and the interpretation, and you can never know what reality is. It's all just part of our human experience. And then, but I mean, I think it's interesting. So I think some of the stuff that I'm not saying machine elves are real, but I do think that I think that there's enough conserved human experience, which I think the instrumentation is what's lacking. Right? So human beings, the scientific process always starts with consistent human observation. And then we develop the tools for experimentation that verify what is correct and what is not correct. But I think there's enough conserved human experience of non-material things that I think that that's real. It's just we have no way, and it's so simple, because if you kind of think about it, do thoughts exist?
I mean, yes, but
Right? So it's a shared delusion from every human on the planet, and yet we have zero proof of the existence of a thought. So that speaks to me of like a fundamental gap between what science is capable of detecting and verifying and what exists in the world. And you can make the argument, which I think is a fair one, that if we don't have an instrument to detect it, it doesn't exist. But I think that that's a problematic argument. But
yeah, it's a little bit of a prideful kind of statement to make.
I mean, there's a lot of arrogance within science too.
Also,
I mean, that's what...
yeah, but I could also see, like, why people want to see sort of the evidence, and because I am that way also naturally. I could not believe or think the way I do unless it got hammered into me by experience, and unless my prefrontal cortex was fully satisfied in it, and so yeah, I'm glad we're having this conversation. I would love to see how this conversation would be different or not in like 5 years, maybe.
No, I mean, I think that's what's so exciting. So I think hopefully we'll learn a lot more about, the therapeutic value. I'm sure we'll learn stuff about the therapeutic value. I don't think we're going to have discovered any major mechanisms or have any scientific breakthroughs about the realness of psychedelic experiences. I would be surprised if that changes in 5 years, but I think, So thanks a lot. I don't remember, Michael, do you have like socials and stuff that you want to send people to if they want more info?
See, that would be really smart for me to capitalize on this, but yeah.
Yeah,
no,
that's okay, dude. We'll we can talk about that more later, but so thanks a lot, Michael, for coming. We had a bunch of questions which we didn't get a chance to get to, but we'll maybe have like, I don't know. We'll see like what questions people have and stuff like that. So thanks a lot, man. Take care, buddy.
Yeah, you too. See you soon.
Adios.
Bye.
Okay. So hope y'all enjoyed that. There are so many good questions about cults and original sin and all this kind of stuff. Like, yeah. So, sometimes on this channel, we talk about things that will help you as a human being. We'll explain things like neuroscience. We'll teach you how to meditate. We had a great, we just uploaded a great video to our YouTube channel about how to develop charisma as an introvert. So this is like a 48-minute video that was a deep dive into really understanding what is the nature of a charisma. How do you, this is the complete absence of negative capability. So it's like, no, we're going to tell you how it is. But I think that when it comes to mental health, there are more conversations than just the technical ones. Like, how do you, like 5 tips to conquer your depression? And I think that, religiosity and spirituality, we talk about, so nowadays when people say spirituality, they basically it almost has become synonymous with this kind of like mindfulness-based karmic religion, Buddhism kind of thing. Like, oh, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. And that means like I meditate, I'm into that stuff. And I do crystal healing. But I think that, there's, and my background is from this like karmic tradition, right? So I've studied Buddhism and Hinduism and meditation and yoga and that kind of stuff. But there's like a huge other tradition. I mean, there are so many different traditions of spirituality, whether you talk about shamanism or Shinto or in the Abrahamic religions, right? Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And I think recently there's been like a push towards some of these Eastern religious concepts. And I think the main reason for that, and that's not wrong. I think that, meditation as a practice is the most robust spiritual practice that has been born out of a religion that has the strongest neuroscience and clinical support for mental health. That's why everyone's doing it now, right? It's because one of these religions produced a particular practice that appears to be the most robust scientific thing that will help your brain, help your mind, help your clinical outcomes for mental health problems. That's why it's grown so fast. But that doesn't mean that there isn't value to exploring other traditions. It doesn't mean, so I think like Kabbalah is a really good example of this. Sufism is a really good example. For whatever reason, there are mystical traditions that are parts of other religions that did not occupy a lot of space in that religion. So Kabbalah is a minority of Judaism, you could argue. And you could also argue that meditation is a minority of Hinduism, honestly. You could say that the minority of people who are very meditation focused branched off into Buddhism. So that's an argument you could definitely make. But I think, we don't talk enough about, like, it's wild, right? So Michael was like suicidal at the age of 13 and God was like, hey man, we're not done with you. And like, that's his experience. And he was like, well, okay, interesting. And then he's like raised as an atheist, like has accepted Jesus into his life. And when we hear that, we immediately respond with like so much skepticism. And we're like, oh my God, this guy's crazy. Oh my God. But I think these are important conversations. Like, the most common, if you look at Islam and Christianity, like these two religions, these Judeo-Christian Abrahamic religions are like the most religious people on the planet fall under these two camps. And mental health and their religious experience is a part of their mental health journey too. Can be good, can be bad, right? There's plenty of abuses of power and cults in meditators and in the Abrahamic religions. So we're not saying it's good or bad. It's just like, here we are talking about mental health and we talk so much about Eastern spirituality, but there's like a couple billion people on the planet who come from a different religious tradition. And it's kind of sad, right? Because we live in a world now where, like, I remember when I was at Mass General, like, basically if you're like religious, you're kind of looked down on in academia. You're viewed as less than. Because you're like, oh my God, this idiot is religious. And so it's kind of weird. And we can have arguments about atheism versus existence of God and stuff like that. I mean, those are useful. I like them. But also, I think the reason that we have conversations on this channel is not to say what is right or wrong. It's to offer different perspectives. And I think it's like super cool to hear from someone who is saved by Jesus, who also understands like neuroscience and RCTs, and doesn't, just because they were saved by Jesus doesn't mean that they think you need to be saved by Jesus. And so, like, that's a valid perspective. And I think and it is common, by the way, y'all. I don't know if y'all know this, but, like, Michael Shu's not the only one. I've worked with so many patients who were, like, saved by God, like, in a very direct and sensory way. And that's what they say. They're like, you'll never believe this, Dr. K. I know it sounds crazy, but God saved my soul, and that's what turned things around for me. And I'm like, cool, man. Tell me about that. Like, great. Let's hear about it. So I hope you all enjoyed today. Please don't take today as pushing a particular belief system, or, my favorite is, oh my God, Dr. K is platforming someone. So I think those considerations are important, and those criticisms are valid. At the same time, like, we're just here to hear different people's stories. Okay. So hopefully y'all enjoyed it. Hopefully y'all learned something, and, let us know, like, give us feedback. If you guys liked today, like, let us know. We can talk more about this stuff. If you guys didn't like today, or like, hey, this was a waste of time, whatever, you guys brought on a religious nut. I don't think Michael is a religious nut. Respect him immensely. Then let us know too. And let us know what more you want to see going forward. And for those of y'all that are like, okay, today was really not concrete, and sure, it was interesting, but I have real problems in my life. One thing you can do if you're struggling with mental health issues or physical health issues, please go see a health professional. If y'all are struggling like Michael did with depression or suicidality, please talk to someone. All right. So even if that calculation is not in your favor right now, I think Michael is a fantastic testament for why we as the field of psychiatry believe that you should not kill yourself. Right? Because things can change. I mean, the dude he's like, I think he's faculty at UCLA now. This guy found God. I think he's married. He's happy. He's living his best life. I don't think he games quite as much as he used to. And so we do believe that things can get better, and you just need some help, right? That's the biggest challenge that we see with depression, is that people are doing it on their own. And like, we're here to help you. Like, that's what we as mental health professionals are here for. And even if the calculus, I'm not saying it's illogical, because I think that's what's really scary. And we talk about that some, and there's in Dr. K's Guide to Depression, one of the earliest videos is this concept of what I call congruent depression. And it's like, when you deserve to be depressed, it's like, yeah, your life does suck, and that's okay, right? Just because your life does objectively suck does not mean that it can't get better. Those are two very different things. Not all depression is caused by cognitive bias, in my opinion. There is a normal range of depression where someone can look at their life and say, hey, this sucks. Anyway, if you want more info on that, you can check out Dr. K's Guide. And if y'all are looking for a different kind of help, if you're looking to actually like push forward and accomplish some of your goals, like if there's a lot of stuff, if like watching YouTube videos and watching these streams are like interesting from a philosophical standpoint, but you have like concrete stuff that you want to do, or all this philosophical exploration is to try to help you figure out what you want to do, definitely check out our coaching program, because our coaching program is built on actually a couple of central ideas. One is finding your purpose in life, first of all, can be done in a concrete way. So purpose is not just something you're like, oh, like I'm walking around and I will find it. No, there are signals within you that is the reason why you're unhappy right now. Like, is the reason why. So if you're like in a dead end job and you're like, I don't know what my purpose is, I don't know if this makes sense. Those two are related. If it was your purpose, there's something that in you that knows it's not your purpose, which is why it feels dead end. So in you is a compass that is actually telling you this is the wrong direction, but you don't know which is the right direction. This doesn't feel good. This doesn't feel good. This doesn't feel good. So there is a process through which you can uncover what that right direction is. And then the other super cool thing about something like coaching is that, see, there are two parts. One is figuring out what your purpose is. And the second is learning how to differentiate what is poor conditioning. Oh, I don't feel like doing it. So what do I mean? When someone says, I don't feel like doing it, there's a differential diagnosis there. Is it that you don't feel like doing it because it doesn't align with your purpose? Or is it that you don't feel like doing it because you've become deconditioned and your brain has become so dopaminergically messed up that you're not going to feel like doing it? So when do you need to push through and when do you need to abandon things? These are the kinds of super concrete problems that we try to solve in coaching. So if that's something that you want to do, and the main thing here is it's about time. Like, sure, you can continue watching stuff on the internet. Like, we believe in that path too. I think the big difference is, where are you going to be 12 weeks from now, 52 weeks from now, 104 weeks from now? So if you're interested in making a really concrete change more quickly, like you want to get the ball rolling, then definitely check it out. So thank you all very much for coming today. It's been awesome being here. And yeah, we've got some really cool stuff coming out on the YouTube side. So we just had a video about how to develop charisma as an introvert. We've got some good stuff coming down the pipeline. Small spoilerino, our video on limerence is finally coming out. So it's in editing right now. We've got a couple of other good ones. So I hope y'all enjoy them, and take care, everybody.